Welcome to A Third Way. I am your host, Richard Garner. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at ZeroDB. What is ZeroDB? It's a drink, but it's more than a drink. I'd say it's a life solution in a stressed out world of high anxiety levels and unfortunately all too many options to caffeinate or lift your energy levels artificially. There aren't enough options. In fact, there are very few, if any, that actually help you quiet the noise. And that is what our friends at ZeroDB have brought to us. Again, it's not just a drink. I'd say it's a life solution. Go to drinkzerodb.com and find out where you can either order it on the website or check the store locator. It's in Whole Foods and a bunch of stores probably near you. drinkzerodb.com, check it out and quiet the noise. Edgar Villanueva is the Senior Vice President of Programs and Advocacy for the Schott Foundation, and he has been working in grant making and philanthropy since 2005. His book, Decolonizing Wealth, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance, is an important breakdown of the links between philanthropy and high finance and how little of the funds goes to world-changing endeavors. We talk about everything from the fallacy of corporate social responsibility and whether we can really rely and trust the people that created the need for charity to also now dictate the solutions to the systemic problems in the world. So, first of all, welcome, Edgar, to A Third Way.
Thanks for having me.
It's a topic I've wanted to discuss for a while, not just in recent times, but I think it's even more relevant these days. But as we heard in the opening, I mean, you've been immersed in this sector for a long time and in senior positions. So you've been able to sort of glean different perspectives from different organizations, sort of on both sides of the fence as well, being able to see how the whole sort of, let's say, philanthropic machine works. But interestingly enough, I noticed your book, the title of your 2018 book is Decolonizing Wealth, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance. So there's a bunch of things that I want to get into literally from the title. But one of the things that sort of stuck out to me, and this was written about the book, it says, Decolonizing Wealth is a provocative analysis of the dysfunctional colonial dynamics at play in philanthropy and finance. So I think it's interesting that you link those two things together, but let's start with philanthropy. What are the colonial dynamics that you're referring to?
Sure. So, colonial dynamics can show up in any sector. Ultimately, they are dynamics that stem from the history of colonization and how colonization is acting and showing up today, actually. It's not just a historical type of force at play. It's a dynamic that is based on a separation-based paradigm or worldview. When you think about our economy and how resources are made and off of extraction in ways that harm people and the planet, there's a colonial dynamic that can be unpacked in that. It's about dividing, conquering, commanding, controlling, and exploiting. And so to think about those dynamics in the context of philanthropy seems a little bit off at first, because philanthropy is a word and is a sector that we think of, good intentions and well-meaning purposes. But even in the space of philanthropy, if we are not attuned to the dynamics of race and power and history, colonial dynamics can manifest in that space. And what they look like, an easy way to think about how colonial dynamics manifest are thinking about who actually has money in the first place to become a philanthropist, right? When you think about the what people are funding and where money is actually going. In the U.S. context, for example, we know that less than 10% of grant dollars go to communities of color. And so for me, this is a philanthropic injustice, right? When you think about the role that Indigenous, Black, and people of color have played in helping to accumulate wealth and build wealth in the U.S., And now we benefit so little from those resources. That's just one example of how the dynamics are manifest.
Well, one of the genius things I think that you do in the book is to do something that you could argue is pretty simple and should be obvious to all of us, but it's like one of those things that until you hear it, you're like, oh yeah, that's right. And that's entangling philanthropy and finance, meaning that, of course, the majority of the philanthropy that's been done over generations has been, well, even as you pointed out, only 10% are going to communities of color and indigenous communities. And so, of course, the majority of the philanthropy and the grants or whatever are foundations set up from wildly successful, wealthy people who have often accumulated that wealth through these colonial practices that you're talking about. And I know that a lot of people will always give, a break or some slack to somebody who's quote unquote doing good, right? So it's like, well, come on, give them, they're giving their money away. What's the problem here? But you've, I think, very importantly at this time cited that no, that it's not as simple as that. Talk about why that link is important to understand.
Sure. As a person who has worked my entire career in the nonprofit sector, I think for a long time I was pretty naive about the connection of my work in the nonprofit sector to the private corporate sector. And even my first job at a foundation was a health foundation that supported nonprofits all across the state of North Carolina to improve health in communities. And it's interesting when I think back then. Our connection to the tobacco industry was a foundation that made its money, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, right? From that accumulated wealth, the foundation was started with the mission of improving health, which there's a lot of irony in that whole sentence
Yes.
that we can unpack.
Yes.
But it is there. We've created sort of these like false firewalls or silos in our communities where we have the nonprofits or the do-gooders, and we have corporations that we tend to demonize. And the fact is, Richard, as you said, the resources or the wealth that we have and that we're stewards over in philanthropy comes from the corporate sector. It comes from private businesses and wealth and families that's been accumulated over time. And so to sort of put that firewall in place to say, well, we're the good guys over here supporting charitable work, and they are the bad guys, is just false. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize when we think about the capital that is held in philanthropic organizations, which is about $1 trillion in philanthropic capital. The vast majority of those resources are actually invested in private industry. The endowments of organizations are in Wall Street. Only a small fraction of resources that are actually a part of that $1 trillion are going out into community in the first place. So that is a question I often pose. What is the net value of philanthropy when we amass wealth through a capitalist kind of system, right? We have this $1 trillion. The vast majority of that wealth is then reinvested in the corporate sector to amass and generate more wealth, and only a small percentage of funding actually goes out to the community for.
Okay, I certainly don't. I don't want to gloss over this. I need to understand this better because this is breaking news for me, especially the scope and the volume of that. When you're talking, trillions with a T, and then you're saying the majority of that money is actually reinvested into the private sector. I mean, that's shocking to me. But give us a little more depth on exactly how that's done.
Sure. So in the U.S., I'll use that context where I'm most familiar. We have a law that was put in place in the 70s in the U.S. called the minimum payout rule. And that rule was put in place back then because folks with wealth and corporations were starting foundations, and there was funding. The funding was not even going to the community. They were getting a major tax write-off to just put the money in the bank under the label of a foundation. And so it took an act of Congress in the 70s to say, well, if you're doing this, you're getting the charitable status, the write-off on your taxes for this, then at least the minimum amount of that money must go to the community every year. And that amount of money is 5%. It's a 5% minimum payout rule over a 3-year rolling average. And
Wow.
so on average in the U.S., when you look at the data for giving for U.S. foundations, and this is a rule that applies only to private foundations. Community foundations are a little bit of a different beast there, but on average, foundations are giving around 7 to 8%. And so you have to ask yourself, well, that's great. That money is going to the community, to nonprofits. We can unpack, who still is getting that money, which predominantly large white institutions. But what's happening with the 95% or so, 92 to 95%? That's the money that is then reinvested in private industry, under this mindset that we need to reinvest this wealth to grow more wealth, so in the future we'll have a larger endowment to be able to support community.
Wow.
There's a lot of I think there's a question that we have to really struggle with around that, because it's philanthropy is fantastic. I'm still a part of this industry. I truly believe in the power of moving capital to the right people at the right time. And there's been a role that philanthropy has played in the civil rights movement historically, and those types of opportunities. But the reality is the vast majority of these resources that would have gone into the public system through taxation are being reinvested in private industry. And the majority of those investments are harmful and extractive. You've got foundations who, with their 5%, are supporting criminal justice reform, but with their 95% are invested in private prisons. And there's no limited conversations happening between the wealth management side of the house and the folks who are working in community to make sure that everything is actually in service of the mission. But in fact, the investments might be canceling out the good that the grants are trying to do.
Well, it's reminiscent of your tobacco example earlier, right?
Exactly.
So, but that I think that's the easiest entry point for most people to get to. And I don't want to use the word cynical here, but I mean, it'd be very difficult not to be cynical after hearing the data that you've just laid out. That, okay, in the end, especially going back when this became a tax loophole, right? We can assume that clearly a significant amount of philanthropic, charitable initiatives, at the very least, we're entangled again with, well, and we also get, a whole bunch of tax relief. It's a win-win. I'm sure it was called a win-win multiple times throughout the years. I have had a love-hate relationship with charity and philanthropy, for most of my life. And I've worked for nonprofits. And this is the difficulty to what you just described. And I could see you're even conflicted at times, which is there's no questioning when somebody who's hungry gets fed, when somebody who is, without maybe training to get a job, like when those things happen, those are real. And again, regardless of to what extent you can argue they wouldn't have happened otherwise. So you can't say, in a sort of across the board that there's not positive things happening. My bigger concern, though, is what you're talking about, which is, how much does the idea of the greater good or the end justify the means allow for, in many cases, the biggest perpetrators of extractive, predatory, capitalistic practices over decades and generations, allow that to continue, where that is really the ultimate, where the paradigm shift has to change? Because I find it ironic that the conditions that are created that require charity and nonprofits are the conditions that exist from the system. So then you get a lot of those people from the system starting foundations, doing CSR initiatives, which I'm sure you got something to say about that. And ultimately, it not only deflects the scrutiny from them, but it allows the practices that are long-term, ultimately more damaging, to continue. How do you reconcile that?
It's your comments are making me think of my favorite Martin Luther King Jr. quote, that philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which make philanthropy necessary. And so, all of these things are true at the same time. It is My work has really been pushing our sector in philanthropy and beyond to just really be honest with the circumstances. Like let's not be naive to think that we're just over in our corner of the world moving money, doing charitable work without being aware of the larger systemic issues that are at play here. Where, of course, we have a history of colonization and extraction where wealth has been taken from people of color, that our economic system has been built off of the slave trade industry. And so this extractive mindset and way of being has kind of built the economic system, which we all participate in now. And so it's one, being able to sort of identify that those dynamics are a part of our history and the way that wealth has been created, taking some ownership around what poverty really is, right? That poverty is the product of public policy, and it's the product of theft, and all of that has been sort of facilitated by white supremacy. And so now you have folks who have wealth and are using that wealth in different ways. And when you think about philanthropy, which should and must and should have public benefit, and the fact that even in that space of how wealth is being generated, that the majority of those resources do not have public benefit, and especially do not have public benefit for people of color, I think we have to grapple with that. Is philanthropy a space where the wealthy are laundering their reputations, as some people say, right?
Mhm.
It's no surprise at all when a billionaire or a millionaire get called out in the press for something terrible. Within weeks, you can almost do a countdown. There's going to be some big announcement of them making a big gift somewhere, right? And it's not to say that money is not being used for good purposes. But what is the role of democracy in all of this, where if the rich would pay taxes, if corporations would pay taxes, that money would go into a public system, our democratic systems, where we would all have a say so and a vote over how those resources are used, versus one or two folks who, because they happen to have wealth, get to dictate and determine where that money goes, what causes are supported. And this kind of goes back to my comments around the colonial dynamics and mindset. There's the opportunity to force assimilation, right? And
Mhm.
to enforce sort of ways of being or ways of thinking. Quick example, if you think about public education, right? And millionaire philanthropists who have an idea or a silver bullet solution around what they think schools should look like, have the opportunity to go and scale that idea across a region or a nation, without any type of community engagement or input, just simply because they have the resources. In those intentions, I believe there's a lot of well-meaning desire to help and make an impact, but we have to question those notions, and bring the lens of history and race and democracy around all of that, to really be clear about what's happening and how could we use resources in a different way that might be more democratic, that might be reparative, to how to the harm that's been done historically to communities.
Mhm. I find it's funny as you're talking, I couldn't help but think of Bill Gates. Now, of course, these days it's such a hot button thing because if you're talking about Bill Gates, what, you're a conspiracy theorist or you don't think vaccines are what? No, no, I'm not. That's a totally separate conversation about vaccination. There's been countries in Africa that have said the approach that Bill Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has taken, and others, is very colonialistic in its approach that, hey, we've got an idea. We believe we can fix the entire vaccination industry. And so somebody who's been not just accused, but indicted for monopolistic predatory business practices in his old business, put on new glasses, put on a sweater. And all of a sudden, I've talked to people who said, like, you used to talk about, like, you used to hate Bill Gates. You used to talk about how he was just this monopolistic whatever. And I've said, like, what's changed? Oh, well, he's given his money away now. He's changed. Well, I don't know. I don't remember when you had dinner with him. But my point is, there's been a lot of complaints out of the countries that and so the press coverage here in the West is, this is a white knight, again, hear the name white knight, philanthropic hero. But then you talk to people and you see news reports out of Africa, out of India, and they have an entire different perspective on him in particular and his, I've got a silver bullet, to your point. How do you feel about, I don't know, I don't want to use the word arrogance, but it's probably appropriate when billionaires, A, they say they want to solve a problem, but B, they don't want to listen to anybody because they believe they have it all figured out.
Yeah. I think it's a couple of things. One is we do celebrate and have marketing campaigns and just the publicity that comes with millionaires and billionaires who are giving I think that takes away from, one, I celebrate that folks are giving. There's a large percentage of wealthy folks who don't give at all, right? So the fact that people are giving, they don't have to. So I will take that and celebrate that. But the data shows that the folks who are actually the most generous and are giving away larger percentage of their income happen to be poor people. And so yes. So it just bothers me that these folks are constantly sort of paraded across the headlines and the magazines and celebrated for doing what they should be doing. If you have that much money, my Lanta, why aren't you should be giving it away? And Mackenzie Bezos said, or Scott, I should say, sorry, recently, in her announcements about, she gave away close to $6 billion in 2020. And I really applaud how she gave and who received those funds, because she absolutely is pushing the boundaries and sort of the norms around that. Lots of Black groups, lots of Indigenous groups got funding. Lots of organizations who received the largest gifts ever in their histories. But at the same time, even Mackenzie Scott acknowledged in that she has benefited from a system that has propped her up to be able to accumulate that much wealth in the first place. And so that's sort of the contradictions that we have to hold in this, is that we have to question, like, what are the policies and the tax systems and that are at play that just allow such a small handful of folks to even generate and amass so much wealth in the first place. And then we have to also just be honest that through their philanthropic giving, they're becoming more wealthy. Like, there's no there are no billionaire philanthropists that are more poor this year because they gave away so much last year. This was a huge tax write-off. And so although the money is going for good causes and community desperately needs that funding, we are also seeing major tax write-offs, and we're seeing funding that could have gone again to our democratic system to pay for public education, to pay for healthcare, to pay for transportation. Those systems are lacking, and so regular everyday folks like myself and people in my community are giving to kind of hold this safety net in place to take care of our families, because our government does not have the adequate resources to cover or has chosen not to cover some of these these areas that are being subsidized in some ways by philanthropists. So it's very complicated, and I hope that we could, that this conversation is shining a light on these contradictions so that we can have the public discourse that's necessary to think about, well, how do we change this? And what are the ways to, when I say decolonize wealth, it really is literally about taking wealth out of these places where it's being hoarded, and redistributing that wealth in places so that we all have wealth, right? And that we all have a say-so and a self-determination about how we want to use money to take care of our communities, because those decisions should not be, exclusively, sitting with a handful of folks who have benefited from history and the ability to accumulate wealth.
I find it interesting, to your point, that the world we're seeing, as though we're sort of progressing in this direction where you could imagine billionaires and specifically even tech billionaires and tech companies almost being more influential than government policy, to your point. I mean, I remember in fact, in this city here, and I'm sure it happened throughout the US, our mayor, was, when Uber came to town, for instance, right? It was like he had a press conference. Well, you're not coming to our town. We have regulations. We have laws here. You're not just rolling in here with whatever. 3 weeks later, he's having another press conference where he's like, what are you going to do? They're here. Right. So I guess we're just going to have to somehow figure that out. And yeah, that's a story that, probably is not unique to, this city or cities throughout North America or elsewhere in the world. So as we sit here today, corporate social responsibility, I mentioned it earlier, CSR. I don't know, every second commercial these days seems to have some CSR element to it. And again, not to be overly cynical, but I've worked in that sector. I've worked with companies doing CSR initiatives. And again, you get that sort of, it's a win-win, but whatever was the PR element of it before, it feels now that it's infinitely more significant. It is, you use the term sort of brand washing, or I can't remember the term you used, laundry, like cleaning your brand, which is a big part of the CSR initiatives. But also, I'll use BLM, for instance, right? It seemed to me that when that was going on, it was, of course, people, got commercials produced immediately. They changed their social media profiles, all about supporting and being seen to support BLM. But in the end, if you ask me, what's easier, to do some brand washing with a commercial, change your Facebook profile to BLM and Black Lives Matter, versus okay, let's see the makeup of your board. Let's hear, if we're using the word systemic racism all the time, well, that obviously implies that it's not necessarily the outward support, it's the system. The system itself is the problem that needs to not just be looked at, it needs to be completely taken apart and put back together. And it feels to me that if you're part of the system, well, that's the biggest threat. So you're more than happy to be able to do commercials with mixed race couples and again, social media campaigns that say all the right things. But in the end, does that again divert our attention from looking at the real problem, Edgar?
It's been really fascinating to watch, and especially in terms of BLM, because when Ferguson happened, BLM was considered by some to be a terrorist group, right? And there was no corporation quickly lining up at that point to be aligned. And I was especially taken back with the commercial I saw from the NFL during the Super Bowl weekend and everything they're standing for. But I'm like, but wait, Colin Kaepernick still is not working, and I think deserves an apology. And so it is, there is, I see, I guess, some pros and cons. On one hand, a lot of this is surfaced. Everyone put out statements, and it was definitely, folks were definitely jumping on the bandwagon around a marketing opportunity with, Black Lives Matter. And this is what happens in philanthropy. In my 16 years, there's always like an issue of the moment that is a fad that everyone is kind of behind and throwing out grant making strategies, and we kind of move on to the next thing. That is a cycle that we absolutely need to break, and to make a longer term commitment to systemic change. I think I'm actually, I appreciate the statements in the conversation, because I do think that sometimes change in this sector do start with around language and having space for conversations. So, for example, in philanthropy, I would say that I put my book out in 2018. Prior to that, I don't think I ever heard anyone say white supremacy at a philanthropic conference ever. And now it's like very common. Like it's like everyone is so comfortable saying that and like having these discussions. And I do think that creating comfort around like using the right words and having the conversation is a starting place. It's not going to get us to where we need for transformative change, but at least folks are now at the table having the conversation. For corporations, I think that the verdict is still out. Like in many ways, there's data that came out that corporations actually move more money towards racial justice this past year than private foundations. And there are folks who critique that data, and say, oh, it's mislabeled. It was stuff they were already doing. But what it really comes down to for me is, one, what is the long-term commitment to continue funding Black-led work, Indigenous-led work? And two, what is the internal culture like for your organizations? To your point, Richard, what are you doing for the people who are actually in your own community? There were several things that came out this past year where Black employees came out of some of these tech and finance companies, kind of, calling out what it was like to, for Black people to work in some of these companies, even like suing companies for sort of internal oppression that they were feeling there. And so, we have to hold the mirror up and not just put out a statement, but like actually dig inwardly and ask ourselves what type of inclusive cultures are we creating inside our institutions? If Black people don't feel safe at the place where they work or feel heard or seen, what right do you have to like proclaim that Black Lives Matter when you're not actually even doing that work at home? So yeah, it's really a point, a moment of reflection, I think, that corporations have to have. I do believe they have a role in dismantling white supremacy and being at the table for this fight, but we need them to come beyond the statements and the marketing propaganda to be a real ally in this movement.
Yeah, agreed. You in the title of your book, and again, I mean, obviously these things aren't random. You're very sort of thoughtful about what you're going to use in terms of the title of a book. Obviously, you use the words healing or heal, and you use the word wisdom, which you're just not going to necessarily, somebody who's looking to be taken seriously by the quote unquote establishment can right out of the gate be like, I could see an editor saying, "Hey, Edgar, I hear what you're saying, but we don't want to be marginalized as soft or as ethereal or whatever it is." And the irony is, to me, I don't think there's two better starting points. If you're talking about transformational change that you just cited earlier, like if we want to get beyond the surface, we got to stop clowning around here. There's tremendous pain and trauma in pretty much every individual, but obviously some disproportionately more than others. And I would argue that there's no other way to get where we say we want to go unless we start there. What was the thinking behind using the word healing and balance and wisdom in order to get a message across that might have sounded at least inconsistent with other messaging that you might hear from people talking about paradigm shifting?
Sure. For me, it really originated from my own personal story. As an Indigenous person who grew up in an urban setting, I had a disconnection from, my home community. Being the only Native in my K-12 education, that experience was isolating. And so I've always been on this journey to like be reconnected to my people, to my teachings and my culture, and to understand where I came from. When I came to work in philanthropy, which is literally like the widest, most elite kind of sector that you can imagine, for 16 years.
Can I just cite the incredible irony of that?
Right, exactly, right. When I started working in the foundation world, I literally like only knew one or two other Indigenous folks in the space, and so I've been on this journey where I've definitely have assimilated to out of survival in a lot of ways, but also trying to hold on to some strand of my identity and remember who I was. At a certain point in time where I got so disillusioned and had experienced so much pain in this work, my path to healing and sort of self discovery came about by really going back home and spending time in my community and talking to my elders around, help me remember who I am and what's important and what is philanthropy anyway? Like, what does that mean to us? And how do we get beyond these like silos and this division and this elitism? And spending time talking to my elders and being in community really just like reminded me that I can complain about everything, I can point fingers, I can be disgruntled employee, or I can really dig deep to understand what is the way forward for us. How do we get out of this mess? How do I heal what is broken inside myself, but also inside this space and actually inside our communities? And it just became clear to me, this notion of healing. It probably also had something to do with my mom being, a domestic worker and taking care of people her whole life. And I went to school for public health. So I think the body is just a metaphor for, when we think about what hurts and what we need to do to move forward. But the truth is to get to a different place, we do have to acknowledge the collective pain, as you were saying, Richard, that everyone is holding. And there's pain and trauma in indigenous communities, in Black communities, but also in white communities. And, trauma of colonization and violence that has been passed down generation after generation. And we've yet to come to terms with that in a lot of places. You all in Canada have had a process of truth and reconciliation. And I know that things aren't perfect now, but it is a step forward that we haven't even had in the US and many other places where we actually refuse to acknowledge our history, and we teach revised history to our children. And so what's happening generation after generation is there's a brokenness that is festering underneath the surface of our lives, and this disjointed collective understanding of who we are and where we came from. And so we keep sort of passing that down versus kind of ripping the band-aid off of it and saying, let's understand how we're all hurting. And if we're all hurting and we can acknowledge that and grieve that together, then just maybe there's an opportunity for us to heal. So in all of the racial healing kind of work that I do, I do bring the concept of all my relationships, which is indigenous wisdom, forward, because it's not about just me healing or indigenous folks healing or Black folks healing, but white people have to also heal, and we can all come to the table together and support each other in that process. I think that's our way out of this.
Yeah, I don't know a human being that doesn't need healing, and that isn't an exaggeration. I mean, I think the problem is that we're getting there. We're getting closer to, I think, acknowledging that collectively. I've often thought about doing like a collective 12-step program for the world, right? Like as one collective, and we can't start that process, as you know, unless you're willing to acknowledge what we're addicted to and what our pain is. And in lieu of somebody setting that up, I think we're going to have to continue to rely on people like yourself doing the work that you're doing. But, you kind of alluded to this, and specifically the North American experience with colonialism and the indigenous population is not well enough documented, but it's known enough to know. And it seems like each year and each decade, we're getting closer to acknowledging just how utterly and completely horrific it was and is. But yet, at the same time, what I find ironic at the least, troubling at the worst, is that we still have the people who are responsible for the generations of certain type of behavior like we were talking about before. And we still have the people who have been responsible for a lot of the trauma and a lot of the pain and a lot of those things now showing up to tell us we've changed, trust us, we got you, we care about you, and we're the stewards for humanity 2.0. I mean, obviously the World Economic Forum and that whole thing has come up a lot these days, and even people like Naomi Klein, she wrote recently, and she's a celebrated journalist and author. If you don't know, she wrote The Shock Doctrine years ago. But she wrote recently, and I know there's massive debates and there's extremes as to which side of that it is. But she wrote, "The Great Reset is not a serious effort to actually solve the crisis it describes. On the contrary, it's an attempt to create a plausible impression that the huge winners in the system are on the verge of voluntarily setting greed aside to get serious about solving raging crises that are radically destabilizing our world." And again, call me cynical, Edgar, but I'm going to disagree that they are the people that should be given the privilege, let alone allowed to decide what the direction of the world is. First of all, how do you feel about that idea? I know we touched on it a bit before with billionaire philanthropic, but even beyond that, the charting and the mapping of the direction of the species, again, seems to be done by the people at the top 0.01%.
Right. I mean, we've been here before historically, right? So it's like we need to learn from history that there always seems to be folks at the top who think they know best, and that and when I was in the UK, I guess it was probably 2019. I remember sitting in a pub and talking to some guys there who were asking me why I was in town. I was telling them a little bit about my work, and they began to share, as white men in the UK, that how they were taught growing up in schools about the white burden, and that it was their responsibility to, to take some ownership and to take on this calling to basically evangelize, save the world, and evangelize the world because they happen to be white and therefore, I guess know better and more civilized and that type of thing. And I was astonished. I didn't actually know that that was a term, let
Wow.
alone that that was actually being taught in schools. But I do think that we are at a place. I'm feeling a little hopeful that there is a shift and people are beginning to understand that those who are the closest to the problems and the solutions actually might have some ideas, right, and some answers to get us out of this. When you think about indigenous people and the resilience that is there, that after all that we've been through, that we are still here and that our cultures are still intact and languages are still here. I mean, that takes some really innovative and
Resilient.
resilience, and it really takes a lot. And it's just now beginning to happen where I see across sectors people are beginning to look at, the way that indigenous people are caring for the planet, the way that indigenous folks are have been dealing with forest fires and preventing forest fires and those types of things. So I'm feeling a little hopeful that that's shifting in some ways. I know that myself and other indigenous colleagues are really being called upon in new ways to share what we know and our perspectives. But this is an age-old problem that we're going to have to continue fighting until folks, elite, wealthy, privileged folks, begin to really understand that their privilege might be blinding them to solutions
Mhm.
that work for everyone. Then and that they may have to take a step back or opt out of being at the front of the line. We're going to continue to face this tension and this struggle. And it really is, there's something that is deeply embedded in these dynamics of colonization that we've all consumed to think that we know best, right?
Mm.
And we've got to take a step back and make space for the brilliance of other people, and especially those who have been the most marginalized, and have been on the receiving end of the pain of all the systems that we're trying to reform.
Mm. It's ironic too that, it almost feels like if we were watching a very long movie, um, it would make sense that, that sort of circle of life would come back, that in the end, we had to sort of return to our roots, to the people who, uh, our ancestors, to rediscover who we are. We got lost somewhere, right? I don't
Absolutely.
want to I'm not a fan of over romanticizing anything because I think it's silly. We're all flawed. We all have imperfections. That is the dark and the light of what makes up human beings and the human condition. And so indigenous populations, of course, I'm not like, of course they fought. There were bad people. Like, I mean, it's not to, but what the one thing that seems to be, I would say, the most significant thing that we lost was sacredness, right? Now, that's a word again that is so marginalized and so almost dismissed because it's got some sort of spiritual connotation to it, or lo and behold, it could be religious or whatever it is. So when everything became matter, right? And people use the word materialism often to describe money, but matter, like just where everything's a commodity, then of course this is the world you're going to get. Like this, of course, everything then is just commodified towards value, including people. And when you hear about, doesn't matter where in the world, Australia, Africa, Asia, North America, South America, there's a constant thread from indigenous populations everywhere in the world that there was just an understanding. It wasn't even, it was like 2 + 2 = 4, that you're not separate from each other or nature. Now, again, for a lot of people, that sounds like crazy, but we're now at a time where, like, quantum physics, for instance, is actually validating the truth that there is the separation is an illusion. So this sacredness that was such a big part of relationships with, again, the animals, the trees, the people, whatever, that being sort of subtracted out of the equation over the course of probably the last 300 or 400 years, maybe the age of reason, whatever it is. How can we get that back into the conversation in a way that's taken seriously? Because to your point, I don't think it's not government policy on its own. It's not a new leader. It's not a new system. It's not Greta Thunberg, to be fair. If all of those things exist without some sort of bigger acknowledgement that we are not separate from everything around us, then how will we ever take it seriously enough that we have kids growing up in generations from now that are like, yeah, obvious, like, you know, cutting down that tree or killing that animal is like stabbing myself in the face with a fork. Like, why would I do that? How do we get back to that? And I mean, again, without at least listening to our elders from our indigenous populations.
Yeah, I really appreciate you raising that, because I think that spirituality is sort of has become this this thing that we don't talk about, you know, and we have separation of church and state, or like whatever kinds of things that have been put in place over time to really separate a sense of spirituality out of the work that we do, and even from ourselves, right? Like, we spend a lot of time talking about the mind and the body, but not our spirits. And I think that we're suffering from a major sense of amnesia about spirituality, and that leaves us all feeling a bit empty, honestly. And when I do the work of, you know, racial justice, racial equity, I'm in and out of organizations all the time, corporations that have really intellectualized, like, you know, a theory of change around diversity and all of this work. And there are absolutely like best practices and things that people can adopt. But I always try to insert into those conversations that the work we're doing today, or the conversation we're having today, is so much bigger than like a workshop or a training.
Yes.
To make your organization a more inclusive organization. This is actually like deeply spiritual and deeply personal. If the only time you're talking about race and power and equity and those types of things is in a, you know, 30-minute workshop at the office, we're never going to get there. This is really something that is like deeply personal and requires personal transformation, and for us all to like look deeply inward, like regardless of like your faith background or belief system, like you have to look deeply inward and reconnect to yourself and to a sense of a higher calling or purpose, and understanding our place in this world, of where we came from and where we sit, and how we are each just so small and insignificant in the greater scheme of things. And we should be having these conversations with our children and with our families. And we can't like professionalize like racial healing or racial justice in this type of way within our sectors. That's just not ever going to cut it. And I can teach, you know, ideas or provide tools, but you know, I've tried to also just create spaces that are healing spaces for people to come and just be vulnerable in their humanity and to open up, because we don't allow for that in so many aspects of our communities. And it's beginning to, beyond like the office or beyond like philanthropic giving, it's really impacting our families, where we don't even know how to have, you know, conversations or build relationships or be intimate with people who are in our closest circles. I do feel slightly hopeful that through this whole pandemic thing, there's been like a crack in all of
Mhm.
this, where there's been, you know, we've been so isolated that I think we're yearning for, you know, some type of deeper connection to each other, and, you know, and maybe to our spirituality. That maybe we are beginning to see that none of us were immune from the trauma of this
Mhm.
pandemic. Almost every single person was impacted in some kind of way. And it's the first time for me in my life where I've seen like almost this collective sense of like, wow, we've got to like, here in New York City, especially where I live, like we have to like everything I do, me wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, like it can have dramatic impacts on other people, right? And so there seems to be this understanding and awakening that I see happening around, like, wow, we've got to take care of each other. And these mutual aid funds that have popped up everywhere are really inspiring for me, because there is sort of this like newfound sense that in some communities that like we've got to take care of each other. We've got to make sure that people have food and people have water and have what they need to bunker down and get through this pandemic. Everyone's not here for the party. I totally understand that, right? But it is sort of a glimmer for me into like a shift that if we could take that to scale in some kind of way, we would be a better society. And undergirding all of that is just a sense of spirituality for me. It is it is sort of just listening, like and being aware of like the space I'm taking up and what other people need around me, and what I might be called to do in this moment, and being willing to kind of be guided by that and step forward and do the right thing. It doesn't have to make sense, or it doesn't have to, we don't have to have a theory of change behind it. Sometimes it's just the right thing to do, to make those efforts within our communities. And but absolutely at work, there are just ways that we can hold space that allows us to be our whole selves. And it's I'm reminded recently I held a healing summit for people of color who work in philanthropy last November. We had 60 or 70 people of color grant makers who are staffing foundations, right? Who are, working again inside very white dominant elitist kind of institutions, many of them corporations. And I wanted to hold this space for them because on top of like that trauma, there was a trauma that everyone was holding post George Floyd. And what must it feel like to be a Black person in your organization having to make a case for Black lives to move some funding to support this work? Like, that's a lot to hold. And I found even then in that space, it took some time and some massaging to get people to a place where they were like, okay, I'm not here representing an organization or here with a talking point from our website, but I can actually be here in my whole full self and allow my emotions and my heart to like be in this space so that I can actually receive some healing. It's like we're so out of practice doing that. And so I think all of us have to find a way back to some type of ceremony, spiritual practice, even if it's just like locking yourself in the bathroom and sitting quiet for 5 minutes a day to feel more connected to yourself. We got to find a way to do that in order to heal and to have an ear that's attuned to transformative change that's outside of any book or journal or guide that I can write or create to support people through a process.
And that anybody can, to be honest, if you take that aspect out of the sort of institutionalized religion, where of course that got diverted at some point to being, about control, about structure. And again, that's not bad. That's helped a lot of people, but the transformational aspect of it isn't always talked about, and it's super important. And to your point, if you don't feel part of a whole, right, and you feel just that you are all there is, then of course this is how you're going to act. You're going to act in your self-interest, full stop. You need to, isn't just an intellectual belief. You have to experience that wholeness in a way that, I get it. I understand that. And I know Dan, our producer, and I talked about when we started this, that we're going to do t-shirts at some point with the best, like a great quote from a guest, and have it on the back, like a third way t-shirts, and then have the great quote. So I want to remember, but so we don't forget, Dan, you can't professionalize racial justice. Edgar Villanueva. Like, that is so perfect in capturing. And again, I don't want to, we always talk about non-dualism on the show as well. So, and you've been very good at that. You've been always good at acknowledging the pros and the cons. And there's, glass half full, glass half empty of everything. And in this case, again, there's people being helped. I get that. It's a start. But I agree with you that in the end, it's not a leader. It's not an organization. It's not the corporation. It's not the politician. It's us individually, simultaneously making that sort of transformation that you're talking about, so that we can show up as our whole self in the whole. And that is going to ultimately, I think, start the dominoes towards a tipping point. It's grassroots like everything else. It doesn't come from the top. It comes from the bottom, if you will. Great stuff today, Edgar. Before we let you go, just finally, and I don't want to, it's tough predicting. You sound like you're an optimistic person. You're going to focus on the glass half full. Obviously, you work in philanthropy, but in the end, what's the thing? If you were sort of given the mic and the direction and the purse strings, and you could make, a fundamental change tomorrow that you think could accelerate the process that you need to see, what would that be?
I think I've been holding the word self-determination a lot lately and thinking about what it means to transfer wealth to communities of color, and for us to build wealth in our own communities so that we're actually liberated from the power dynamic of having to pander to other folks in power, and we have the resources that we need to take care of our communities in our own self-determined way. So that is sort of a message that I've been pushing, and all of the well-meaning intentions around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging in philanthropy. Ultimately, even those more participatory types of supports and community, there still is the question of ownership. And so I want to push folks to think about what might it look like to actually transfer ownership. And we created a fund through my organization, Decolonizing Wealth project, called Liberated Capital, where we are really offering a platform for people to do that. We've had folks to sign over their donor advised funds to us to just say, you all take the money, wow, and we trust you to get this to community in a way that makes sense to you all. That ultimately for me is really a decision, a behavior, and an exercise in trust and solidarity that is really the most radical way that someone that's a philanthropist can behave. The last thing I'll say, I encourage everyone, regardless of whether you're a philanthropist or a leader in a corporation or whatever role you have in life, to really ask yourself how can you be a leader. In some writing that I've been doing recently for a second edition of the book that's coming out in August, that's really where I focus, because I haven't always been a person that thought of myself as a healer or that has a lot of expertise in this. I was just a person who was willing to be vulnerable and to step forward and say, call out some things that I saw and make myself available to be an instrument of change and to be vulnerable in my own journey and to share, hey, I'm figuring this thing out, or I'm hurting here, or I found hope and healing here. And everyone can do that. Everyone can have a role in this process of healing if they are willing to really sort of step forward. And so to get to that collective healing, we've all got to take on that identity of being a healer. And so that's my invitation for folks, is to figure out what can you do to heal yourself, and then what can you do to share a little bit of healing with those in your circle.
Amen to that. Well said, Edgar. I look forward to the second edition of the book. For those people who haven't had a chance to read the book, where is it and where can people find it?
Sure, it's available anywhere books are sold. You can go to our website, decolonizingwealth.com, to check out more information about it. We also just put out an accompanied journal called Money as Medicine that just helps folks who want to dig in and apply and journal and really think about applying the concepts in the book to your life, your family, your job. We created some tools to support that.
Fantastic. So hopefully when the book comes out in August 2021, the second edition, we can have you back, see how you're doing, and talk about where things are. And it's only 6 months away, but these days, especially, we're at an inflection point. It feels like there's a lot of big discussions going on about kind of where things go. Hopefully more Edgar Villanuevas are at the table of those conversations going forward. Thanks for joining us today on A Third Way, Edgar, and continued success.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure.